My name is Reinhard Falkenberg. I work for the NYUAD Abu Dhabi Institute, and it is my great pleasure tonight to see you all gathered to hear the presentation of my good friend and former colleague, Christopher Ocker, who is professor of the history of European religion in Berkeley and in San Anselmo, that is to say in the San Francisco Theological Seminary and at the GTU, the Graduate Theological Union, which is the major school for graduate school for religion actually on the West Coast in the United States. Let me say a few words about Chris Ocker, and then I'm so happy to hand the floor to him. I'm very curious what he has to say as a great specialist of medieval, late medieval, and early modern European religion, and the entanglements that appear in those days, perhaps as much as today, in the area of religion. Professor Ocker received his PhD in 1991 from the Princeton Theological Seminary. He has received several major awards. For example, from the Institution for European History in the Division of the History of Religion, I think it is in Mainz. He got twice, I think, an Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung Fellowship, 1995 and 2009. He is currently, as I said, professor at Berkeley. His research brought him actually in most cases many years to especially to Germany. But as I said, he is a major expert in the world of European religion, especially of the Reformation and the longue durée, the long period of time that led to what we call the Reformation in the 16th century. But one of his main theses is that this is a kind of a narrowing down of our understanding of the Reformation. The Reformation has a long history, and it actually encompasses relationship between Christendom and Islam, as you will hear. He was also a visiting fellow at the Max Planck Institute, very honorable award in Göttingen. He has published several books, two of which I will mention. One is Biblical Poetics Before Humanism and Reformation, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2002, and another book, Church Robbers. The title is Church Robbers and Reformers in Germany in the beginning of the 16th century, Confiscation and Religious Purpose in the Holy Roman Empire, which was published in 2006. He has also published dozens of articles on medieval religious conflict and intellectual history. So Chris is much more than a historian of religion. He is a historian of intellectual history in the late Middle Ages, especially in the early modern period. And it is my great pleasure and great joy that he has come all the way from Berkeley to address you all tonight, invited by the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. Please, ladies and gentlemen, give him an applause.
Thank you very much for those kind words. And my gratitude to NYU Abu Dhabi. I count it a great privilege to be here tonight and to speak with you, to share my thoughts, and I hope to have a conversation afterwards. We are going to consider tonight a peculiar episode in the history of the papacy and in the history of Western Christianity. And this episode takes place in the middle of the 15th century. We're looking at a letter by Pope Pius II, which was written in the year 1461. 1461, a few years after Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, Ottoman Sultan, had conquered the city of Constantinople, bringing an end to the Byzantine Empire. A very important moment in the history of the Western world. So we're going to think a little bit about some of the strange things that this Pope has said and some of the predictable things that he said. And I'd like to play a little bit with the difference between some of those predictable things and some of those more surprising things. Before I get into that, before I bring up the letter itself, before I talk about the context of the letter, its broad context, both about the time it was written, in that century, and in the decades to follow. Before I do that, I want to make some general comments about the study of religion and the study of civilizations. Because I'm going to propose to you that one of the most important things that we can do in studying religion is recognize one quality of the backdrop of religions, and that is the entanglement of civilizations. Now, you may recall, those of you who are over the age of 40 and occasionally read the American press will almost certainly recall that back in the 1990s, there was a considerable discussion in the United States especially about an idea that was associated with a historian of Islam at Princeton University named Bernard Lewis, and a political scientist at Harvard University named Samuel P. Huntington. And Bernard Lewis and Samuel P. Huntington developed this idea of a clash of civilizations. Lewis in an article in the Atlantic Monthly in 1990, and Huntington in an article in Foreign Affairs in 1991. This concept of a clash of civilizations proved to be a very effective discourse, perhaps I should say ideology, during the first Bush administration, seemed to shape a lot of American foreign policy at the time. Just to remind you, if you don't remember what that is or haven't heard of it, Huntington believed that the history of civilizations had to be understood as a conflict between what he believed were 9 basic civilizations in the world. And he thought that after the fall of the Soviet Union, the conflict between what he called Western civilizations, and these are the 9 color-coded on the map that he published in a book then bearing the same title, Clash of Civilizations, in 1996. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Huntington believed that the conflict between the West and Islam would come to play a particularly formative role in global politics. His concept was judged by many, and I would agree with the many in this, to be crude. He juxtaposed the West and Islam in very absolute terms. He said, I quote, "The fundamental problem for the West is not Islamic fundamentalism. It is," he said, "Islam, a different civilization whose people are convinced of the superiority of their culture and are obsessed with the inferiority of their power," unquote. And on the other side, he continued, "The problem for Islam is the West, a different civilization whose people are convinced of the universality of their culture and believe that their superior, if declining power, imposes on them the obligation to extend that culture throughout the world." So, unquote. The idea that he was proposing is that these are necessary juxtapositions. These civilizations are built to conflict with one another. Then came George Bush's, then came the first Iraq War and 9/11, the war on terror, and this idea of a clash of civilizations seemed to have considerable pull in some of the circles in the Republican Party in particular. An NYU scholar, Benoit Chaland, together with Chiara Bottici, has recently published a book called The Myth of the Clash of Civilizations, in which they described how this concept was used as an instrument, a myth in that instrumental sense, as they said, for producing a reality and an identity yet to come. In other words, they argued that this idea of a clash was not simply an observation about civilizations. It was an attempt to actually create a conflict of civilizations, and it was, in fact, for a long time seemed to be quite effective. Well, the idea of this clash prompted a very strong reaction and a pretty strong consensus in reaction to the idea of a clash among some public figures and quite a large number of scholars. The consensus in opposition argued that civilizations were and are, to the contrary of Huntington, they are deeply involved and engaged with one another, both in the past and in the present. And we might call this alternative model an entanglement of civilizations. So among those people who very strongly criticized Huntington's idea was Edward Said, the literary critic at Columbia University, particularly in a famous lecture that he gave at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in 1996, and also Mohammad Khatami, the reformed president of Iran in the early 2000s, who in the year 2000, speaking before the UN Millennial Roundtable, called for a dialogue of civilizations, and another very strong promoter of an alternative in public life is Vladimir Yakunin, the president of the Russian Railways Joint Stock Company. He's sometimes described as the second most powerful man in Russia. Yakunin was the founding director of an organization called the World Public Forum Dialogue of Civilizations, which holds annual meetings on the island of Rhodes and brings together intellectuals, religious leaders, and political figures to discuss essentially the interactions of civilizations across all borders. And even Barack Obama, way back in 2009, in his speech before the Turkish parliament, insisted that, I quote, "the United States is not and never will be at war with Islam." And then a few weeks later at Cairo University, pointed to this notion of clash when he said, "Some say civilizations are doomed to clash, but," he countered, "young people of every faith in every country have the ability to reimagine the world, to remake the world." So even in public discourse, we see these alternative views that insist that a clash, assuming a clash, the juxtaposition of incompatible belief systems, laws, and so forth, it can't have the final word. Well, there were many historians and anthropologists and philosophers who've also challenged this idea. Particularly in the last 10 years, they've done a great deal of work to show that the entanglements between Europe and Islam, this is our topic tonight, in the medieval and early modern period were in fact intense and sustained. Others have insisted that the intensification of cross-cultural contact across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa increased in the early modern period, with or without European colonization. The impetus didn't just come from Europe but through its voyages abroad and the establishment of European colonies. No, quite the contrary. We can see the same thing is happening in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, throughout the Mediterranean world, and even in Africa, an intensification of contact in the early modern period. There is a growing band of historians who study cultural exchanges across the Mediterranean, especially between Europe and the Ottoman Empire. And all of this really should lead us to look at civilizations not as self-contained entities or closed systems that collide, but to think of civilizations as things that overlap, fuse, and exchange their cultural DNA. And that's sort of the natural condition of civilizations. Now, How does religion fit into all of this? Well, to be honest, religions do usually play a very important role in defining distinctions between groups of people. Most religions have functioned in a way that helps people establish differences between groups. To say that I am a Christian is not to be a Muslim. To be a Muslim is not to be a Christian or a Jew. To be a Hindu is not to be a Jainist. To be a Jainist is not to be a Sikh. And these really matter to religions. We might be tempted to say, and many I think are tempted to say, that, well, you see, religions are part of the problem. Religions actually cause this idea of diametric oppositions. We have to get religion out of the equation. Remove the cancer, cure the patient. If we are interested in building collaborations, productive collaborations and dialogue across the world, in our world, if we're interested in doing this, and we think that the way to do it will be to remove religions from the equation, we have a little bit of a problem. For example, in the case of Christianity, we have the problem that Western-related Christians comprise about 1.9 billion people in the world today, about a quarter of humanity. We could quibble about these numbers, and if you like afterwards, we can talk about these. The clever among you, I know, have questions bubbling up in your mind about this, but take this general figure as evidence of the presence of religion in human interactions. And you, I think, will have to agree that religion is a big thing. This Western kinds of Christianity comprise a pretty significant piece of humanity. Same for Islam. If we take together all the Muslims in the world, we have about 1.6 billion people. And again, that's about a quarter of humanity. If our purpose is to build productive, meaningful, fair and just collaborations between people across civilizations, and we think that we're going to do it by removing religion from the equation, we have a problem. It's going to take us a very long time. So my challenge is, and personally I actually don't have any individual need or desire to take religion out of the equation. I'm perfectly happy to accept this as an important part of the lives of very many people on Earth today. Okay, so what have we got? Civilizations are entangled. Religious differences matter in social life. I think that one way to deal with this challenge is to recognize that a critical study of the history of religion, a critical study, for example, of the history of Christianity, which is what we're essentially doing tonight, acknowledges religious conflict, doesn't gloss over it or pretend that it doesn't exist. It acknowledges the role of religions in differentiating groups of people from one another, but does not give conflict the last word. It helps us to reinterpret the history of religion in a complex manner, sufficiently complex to show how even in polemic and confrontation, there is a more fundamental entanglement between and across religious lines. The entanglements out of which global collaborations and exchange do grow. So that is my general assumption about the nature of civilizations. And now we're going to turn to something quite different. We're going to look at a particular case, this peculiar case that I've named for our consideration tonight, this letter of Pope Pius II, this 15th century case, early at the beginnings of the imperial phase of Ottoman history. This is a copy of the letter. This particular copy was produced a little bit later than 1461. It was prepared for King Louis XI of France. He came to the throne the year that Pope Pius II wrote this letter that we're considering in 1461. It was given to him as a gift by one of his chaplains, one of his close advisors. You can see that it has here at the top in this is called a historiated initial, the decorated initial. This is the shield of the King of France. And then here again at the bottom, held by two angels. There are 40 handwritten copies of this letter that circulated that we still possess. So more copies would have circulated, handwritten manuscript copies. There are 9 printed editions that were produced before the year 1500. 40 manuscript copies for a medievalist like myself, 40 manuscript copies, 9 printed editions for the latter 15th century. That counts as pretty good distribution, production level. So this is something that got around. We actually possess the original working draft that Pius II used in a Vatican manuscript. We have his revisions. We can see how he worked, how he used the writings of one of his friends to revise his arguments in this letter. This is a very well-documented source. So it's quite surprising that we don't know one basic thing about it. The one basic thing we don't know is whether or not he actually sent it. We don't know if he actually sent it to the Sultan, if he wrote it with the intention of the Sultan reading it. We don't, therefore, know that the Sultan ever read it. It's a little bit puzzling. Scholars have debated whether or not he meant for the Sultan to read it, or whether it was really written for a European audience, some kind of propaganda to help mobilize a crusade. We'll talk about that in a minute. It actually doesn't really matter. The reason it doesn't matter is because the letter circulated, and the audience who read this letter simply took it at face value. In other words, this letter, which is a significant piece, as I'll explain to you in a minute, helped shape the European knowledge base that they had, such as it was, of the Muslim world and of Islam. This letter was actually a pretty significant contributor to that public knowledge that Europeans had. So whether or not he actually sent it, it shaped the way Europeans thought about Islam. So it's a valuable source to us as we're trying to understand the interactions between these civilizations. So that's what we're going to consider. It's also conceivable that he would have sent it. We know that Mehmed actually listened to Christians at court. He invited a prominent Christian scholar who was a member of his court, a courtier named George Amiruzes, to participate in the discussions of intellectuals in his personal entourage. We know that he requested of the Greek Orthodox Patriarch Gennadios a summary of Christian faith. So that seems, the idea that he could be interested in such a thing is possible. It's not preposterous to suggest it. We also know that a future pope, Pope Paul II, a few years after Pius II died, actually sent an envoy to the court of the Sultan George of Trebizond, who we'll talk about a little bit later, with the intention of seeking an audience. George of Trebizond prepared the speeches that he would make to the Sultan, the appeals, whatnot, but he never won the audience. So that was a failed attempt, but again, a possible attempt. So it's not completely out of the question to assume that he meant the Sultan to consider these things. For our purpose, though, we're interested in what Europeans were thinking and how they got to think that way. This letter was part of a group of documents circulating, actually all of which turn out to be fictional, fakes. They included this pretended response to Mehmed's letter. So Europeans not only believed that Pius had sent this letter to Mehmed, they believed that he read it and responded to it in this letter right here that you're looking at in one of its printed versions. It was attributed to a man named Morbisanus. It is actually an example of a popular genre of fake sultan letters that circulated in Europe. The genre included at least 90 manuscripts and over 300 printed texts of fake sultan letters that circulated in Europe. And again, Europeans did not necessarily know that these were fakes. So they're taking this as a source of real knowledge. Well, you can see where this could go. This could be pretty nasty because they're basing their knowledge on these basically self-generated sources. So they could be quite scandalous. And that's the surprising thing. They are sometimes very scandalous, but they're not only very scandalous. They actually sometimes include a somewhat complicated, ambivalent response to the other. In other words, when they're imagining the Muslim other, they're doing it in a complicated way, not in the black and white terms that you might expect a religion to encourage you to do, right? Our religion is true, their religion is emphatically false. God means for us to win, God means for them to lose. They're not entirely sure, especially about that last point. The genre also includes a verse version of Pope Pius II's appeal to Mehmed. So written in a poetic form for convenient use by students in school. And some of these verse versions also included a verse version of a response by the Sultan. Once again, the image that people are getting is the image of an actual exchange. Then finally, this one remarkable source is pretended to be an edition of letters discovered by this man, Laudivio Zacchia, and he claims that he discovered these letters and translated them from Greek and Turkish and whatever else into Latin. This letter, this collection of letters attributed to Mehmed II, which described his ambitions to extend his empire westward, then circulated in very, very many editions. And they were taken at face value, and again, this is a fake, they were taken at face value as a valid source of knowledge of Ottoman history all the way through most of the 17th century. Up for as long as, and this is what's interesting about this, for as long as Europeans felt threatened by the Ottomans, up until the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683. So we've got this body of literature that is producing knowledge of the other among Europeans. And that knowledge includes an image of Pope Pius II having an actual exchange with the Sultan Mehmed. This is Mehmed. This is a portrait of Mehmed that's produced. Actually, the influences on this portrait are Timurid. They come from the direction of Persia. And also, this is produced late in his reign, probably by the first person mentioned here on the slide, Sinan Bey. Scholars point out that it actually shows some influence of Western art, and you'll understand why that might be interesting a little later on. These portraits are believed to have been produced for diplomatic exchanges. We know that Italian city-states regularly did this, royal courts in the West did this, and we also know that at Mehmed's court, he hired cultivated artists who could contribute portraits that would be used in diplomatic exchanges. That's probably what this was made for. Now, Mehmed briefly took over the ruling authority from his father in the 1440s, and then in 1451, at 21 years of age, he became the Sultan. 2 years later, he laid siege to the city of Constantinople, and he conquered the city in what everyone agrees to have been a brutal and very effective siege in May of 1453. Constantinople. This was a very, very symbolically important thing to do. The city of Constantinople had its origins in the 4th century. The Emperor Constantine, a Roman emperor, some of you may recall, had embraced Christianity, basically, to be more accurate. They didn't quite know this in the 15th century, but the way we look at it now is he embraced Christ as his patron deity. He acted in a fashion that was consistent with the Roman emperor. And this quote-unquote conversion eventually led to the conversion of the Roman Empire. Well, in the 15th century, they thought it was definitive. He converted to Christianity. There are problems with that idea, but he converted to Christianity. The empire became Christian, and from that point on, in their minds, the Roman Empire was a Christian empire. Christianity then fulfilled the Roman legacy. Now comes Mehmed, and many years later, he conquers that ancient capital of Christian empire. And he sends shockwaves throughout the Western world. Now, in the West, they saw this coming. They saw the potential for this coming. They saw Ottoman power expanding for about a century before Constantinople fell. The Ottomans initially gained control of the area surrounding Constantinople. Constantinople is right here on the European side of the Bosphorus, the straits here between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea. And the yellow area on the map indicates this area that they controlled already in the middle of the 14th century. Between 1359 and 1451, Mehmed's coming to power, they gained control of Anatolia and most of the Balkans, the gold areas on this map. During the reign of Mehmed Fatih, Mehmed II, from 1451 to 1481, they gained control of these red areas on the map. Most of the Aegean Islands, most of Bosnia, all of Serbia, pretty much all of Asia Minor, while at the same time they subjected the Crimean Khanate to Ottoman control. Then later they would annex the Crimea to Ottoman possessions. Mehmed then set up his successors to continue to extend Ottoman power. The most important was not his immediate successor, Bayezid, but Bayezid's son, Mehmed's grandson, Selim I, who gained control of the violet areas on this map. He brought an end to the Mamluk Sultanate, reducing Egypt to Ottoman control, gaining control of the entire Levant. That basically made the Ottomans the powerhouse of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was then Mehmed's great-grandson, Suleiman, the lawgiver, known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent, who, in the purple areas of the map, extended the empire further into Europe, over about half of Hungary and almost all of the arable lands along the southern shores of the Mediterranean. And then in the 17th century, the light blue areas were added that included, by now, most of this is Safavid Persia, is also under Ottoman control. It went further into Azerbaijan. The greatest extent of the Ottoman Empire then comes at the end of the 16th and early 17th centuries. So this is a pretty phenomenal expansion that Europeans were witnessing on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, and it included control of the entire, by the 16th century, control for most of the 16th century, control of the entire southern shore of the Mediterranean as well. How did they respond to this growing threat? Well, they responded by taking recourse to old traditions. You see, Europeans had a problem. Politically, Europe was extraordinarily fragmented. The only way to create unity was, that they really knew, was to appeal to religious unity. One of the great vehicles of religious unity was the call to crusade. So the European response was to try to demand religious unity within Europe, and then taking this unified body and launching it in a holy war against the Muslim enemy. Well, that certainly sounds like clash of civilizations sort of stuff. The problem was, organizing a crusade had proved to be pretty much impossible. By the time we get to Mehmed, the possibility had shown itself to be mostly exhausted. It was just really a hard thing to do. In the decades before Mehmed came to power, the Europeans called a council that met at Basel, a church council. It's known as the Council of Basel, Ferrara, and Florence, because the council convened at Basel in 1431, and then it moved to Ferrara in 1437, and then moved to Florence. At this council, the Europeans not only tried to create unity, they debated the basis of unity. And in conflict there were two fundamentally different approaches. One was a representational approach. Many at the council argued that the Pope could not actually be depended upon to create religious unity, so you needed a council of churchmen or church figures, church leaders, and political leaders together who represented a power that was diffused throughout the Christian faithful in the world. They exercised that power. That would create unity. This was called the conciliar approach, or the conciliar option. At the council, a debate broke out between that and the papalist option, which essentially said, no, unity is created by a papal spiritual monarchy. You put the Pope in charge. The Pope controls religious life ultimately. It's more complicated than that. And this debate caused the council to split. The papal party went to Ferrara and then to Florence, and at Basel, the conciliar party tried to continue. And the long and the short of it was this, that the spiritual monarchists, if you will, were the group that won. Eventually, they convinced the political leaders who were supporting the conciliarists to switch sides, and the council that was remaining at Basel petered out, and that conciliar option, creating a kind of religious parliament to decide how to reform Christendom and unify Christendom, petered out. At the same time, there was a division between the Latin Church, the churches of Western Europe, and the Byzantine Church, the Church of the Byzantine Empire. The division was hundreds of years old by this point. The theologians who were present at this council believed that they needed to reunite the Latin and Greek churches. And the papal part of the council then continued that effort. So at Ferrara and Florence, they managed to bring a number of Greek theologians, eventually also Egyptian Coptic theologians and Armenian Coptic theologians, and the Greek and the Latin theologians and the Patriarch and even the Byzantine Emperor made an appearance. They reached an agreement that brought an end to the division of Eastern and Western churches. In fact, this is the document of that agreement, which was kept in this ornate box that was donated by a cardinal to preserve the records of the council. Well, there you had it. Christendom united. No more divisions. They figured it all out. Now we're ready to meet this challenge on our eastern frontier, right? Not at all. The Byzantines went home, and the emperor realized that he had very little investment in this. He also realized that he also understood perfectly well that Europe was very disunited. Most of the islands in the Aegean were controlled by Italian city-states. There was a Latin community, basically a satellite of the city of Genoa, just across the little bay there by Constantinople. The idea of clear divisions now suddenly coming to an end must have looked slightly ridiculous. The clergy back in the Byzantine Empire rejected the agreement, and the whole thing amounted to next to nothing. Well, that Basel Rump Parliament concluded in 1449. 1451, Mehmed comes to power. 1453, he takes the city of Constantinople, and where's the unity, the spiritual unity that's going to save Europe from its political fragmentation? Nowhere to be found. What did the popes do? They go back to the rhetoric of holy war. And they say, we need to unite, build a united front against this enemy. To make the point, they relied on accounts of the atrocities committed in the siege and conquest of Constantinople. There were two reports, there were two Byzantine refugees that ended up appearing at the meeting of the Estates of the Holy Roman Empire in Frankfurt in the next year, where a holy war they were trying to organize a holy war, and they even found themselves as far away as England. They were telling stories about, and this was truly bizarre, they were telling stories that when Mehmed took the city of Constantinople, he not only killed a lot of nuns and slaughtered indiscriminately many kinds of people, doing this demonstratively before holy icons. They claimed that he had raped the daughter of the High Admiral, the Byzantine High Admiral, on the altar of the Hagia Sophia, the most holy church in the Byzantine Empire. It's a completely bizarre notion because we know that the High Admiral's daughters were actually safely put away in Italy, were nowhere to be found. These stories of atrocity, nevertheless, were circulating. There were more sober accounts that stressed the political intentions of the Sultan. On the island of Rhodes, the knights who governed the island of Rhodes, the Hospitallers of St. John said, "Mehmed's heart swells with pride, and he boasts that he has equaled or surpassed the deeds of Alexander of Macedon," Alexander the Great, who centuries before the Common Era had extended the Greek Empire as far, all the way across Iran. He also threatens that he will attempt to do what Alexander never did, to push into Italy and the regions of the West with his arms and might, and see whether fortune shall favor him there as it has throughout the East. This is why all Christian kings and princes should turn their minds to some sort of pact so that they may resist the ferocious power of this tyrant who has been roused to destroy Christians. Pius II, who now still a cardinal, was actually trying to help the Pope organize a holy war. He once observed, after the conquest. Now Mohammed reigns among us. Now the Turk hangs over our very head. The feeling of threat was quite palpable, even if you weren't telling really exaggerated stories about the conquest. They tried to organize a crusade. Pius II, the future Pius II, appeared at this meeting of imperial estates in Frankfurt in 1454, was stunned at the skepticism and disinterest that he met there. 1459, when he was crowned Pope Pius II, he assembled a congress of political leaders at the city of Mantua, and again was stunned at the skepticism he met there. He got a few people to make vows to go on the crusade, but they ignored the vows. It just wasn't working. Finally, in 1464, while he was dying, he tried to launch a crusade. He got the city of Vienna, which had very strong economic and property interests in the Aegean, to support him in this. The Viennese fleet was the only substantial contribution he received. He died 2 days after the fleet arrived, and everybody went home. The problem was that European powers had much more interest fighting each other than they did fighting a foreign enemy. Pius II, in 1462, talking about his efforts to organize this campaign, he observed, "I'm like a merchant who has not kept up payments to his creditors and has no more credit. Each one sizes," this is the Pope speaking, he's a very grandiose person, he wears a very impressive crown. "Each one sizes me up with his measuring stick, and each one thinks I'm unsteady and broke." He says nobody wants to invest in him. And that's where roughly things stood when Pius II wrote his letter to Mehmed II. Here's why I told you all of that. That bitter experience of trying to organize a campaign forced these people to think, a circle of people, Pius II and actually a group of his friends, to reconsider the way in which they approached Islam. One of those companions who joined him in this enterprise was Nicholas of Cusa, a very interesting intellectual. Here he is in a relief statue in the church where he's buried. It was the church associated with his office as cardinal. He's giving in Rome, San Pietro in Vincoli, he's giving homage to St. Peter, the first of the popes, expressing his papal allegiance. Another was this theologian, Juan de Segovia, who may be depicted in this very famous painting by Jan van Eyck. This is showing you a close-up of people who were involved in that council at Basel. Pope Eugenius IV over here, the Holy Roman Emperor. This is the King of Castile. These three people are members of the King of Castile, Juan de Castile's entourage. They included a Salamanca theologian who we know was Juan de Segovia, and that's why we think that he may be depicted here. Another remarkable figure in this reconsideration of approaches to Islam among Catholic theologians and the Pope himself. Another individual involved in this was the person I mentioned earlier, George, did I mention him earlier? I'm not sure now. George of Trebizond. He was a Greek theologian and philosopher who was involved in that council in Basel. When he went back to the Byzantine Empire, he was forced into exile because they believed that he accepted Christian heresies by contracting this peace. So he then moved to the West, like a number of other intellectuals. They played a very important role in the formation of humanism in the West, actually. And George of Trebizond ended up becoming an important teacher and kind of hanger-on in papal circles. Also made some very interesting contributions to this reconsideration that we don't have time to discuss tonight. But of all these people, the most influential by far was Pope Pius II. Wasn't necessarily the greatest mind among them, Juan de Segovia was certainly the most interesting mind, and Nicholas of Cusa was almost surely the smartest, but he was certainly among the very clever of them. Pius II's letter to Mehmed circulated some of these new ideas in a more effective manner than any of the rest of them. So let's consider the letter itself. Now, I don't want to romanticize this reconsideration that I'm telling you about. A lot of this letter actually reproduces standard polemical themes. These standard polemical themes, interestingly, were established in the East, actually in Syria, Iraq, and Iran, in the 8th and 9th centuries. The basic polemical themes consist of Muslim positions against Christianity and Christian positions against Islam. And these are well established by the 9th century, and they get repeated again and again in many different contexts. Muslims argued that Jews and Christians corrupted the text of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and thereby obscured biblical prophecies that pointed to the coming of Muhammad as a prophet. And they also argued that Christian beliefs of a triune and incarnated God are irrational. Those 2 points are some of the key points that appear again and again. The Christian side argued responses to these points, and actually it turns out that the role of responding to challenges from Islam played an important role in forming Christian manners of argumentation. We can talk about that later if you like. They argued that Muhammad was not a prophet, but learned his doctrine from a Christian heretic. And many versions of that story then included the insertion of a Jew who kind of complicates matters more and increases the error. This is important to recognize. It's sometimes puzzling that European culture seems so fixated on the person of the prophet. There's nothing really quite comparable, I don't believe, in Islam regarding Christianity, where a defamation of a key figure, a Muslim has no need to defame Christ. But Europeans have traditionally relied heavily on defamation as a way, as part of the sort of whole ensemble of arguments against the prophethood of Muhammad. And this is something that began quite early. In addition, then, the Christians, of course, argued that their scripture was indeed reliable, that Christian beliefs were rational. And then they had another peculiar conviction that's also an enduring feature of Christian European images of Islam, that Islam is a pleasure-seeking religion. And that usually had to do with their response to the idea of polygamy. They just thought that was an expression of lust. And then, of course, they cited descriptions of paradise and whatnot as evidence of this notion, whereas Christianity, of course, was very spiritual and cerebral. And of course, this is not a fair, these polemical points are not fair. They don't come from actual Muslim informants. They're repeated amongst themselves. And yes, indeed, Pius II repeats all of these things and argues them out and tries to make his case, presumably to Mehmed, that Christianity is a truer religion and that he had been deceived by the teachers of Islam from seeing the truth that is actually so near and embedded within Islam. And that follows a kind of typical polemical approach. This is what's so surprising. It's an offer. Near the beginning of this letter, Pius II acknowledges the Sultan's imperial ambition. He acknowledges the Sultan's desire to subject Christendom. He admits Mehmed's strength. And he makes a hollow promise that if he invades the West, that invasion of Italy, then the Christians will unite and he'll have a really hard time of it. After he says all these things, essentially acknowledging the strength of Mehmed's position, he says, so that I may come to the point to which my oration rushes and declare what compels me to write, and display to you your glory and well-being. Give your attention to these few things. If you wish to extend your empire over Christians and make your name very glorious, there is no need for gold, no need for weapons, no need for armies, no need for divisions. A tiny thing can render you the greatest, most powerful, and most resplendent human being among everyone who lives today. What is it, you ask? It's not hard to find. It's not far to search out. It can be found among all nations. It is a tiny splash of water by which you shall be baptized and get yourself to a Christian sanctuary and believe the gospel. Then again, near the conclusion of this letter, so you've got, this is the sandwich, the two pieces of bread on the sandwich of a polemical case for the superiority of Christianity. Just a tiny splash of water separates you from world empire. And then at the other end, again, referring to baptism, if you're baptized, so you will gain your soul. So will you govern the Turkish nation well. So will they be able to complete your plans. So all Greece, all Italy, all Europe will marvel. So Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic prose and poetry will cheer you. So all barbarian nations will cheer you. And there will never be a time when your praises cease, and they will call you the author and founder of a tranquil peace. So will the Turkish nation complete your plans. The poets of the world's civilizations will cheer Mehmed, auctor et fundator quietis, author, founder of a tranquil peace. Now, this is extraordinary praise from a pope for a Muslim ruler. Granted, it comes with a rather obnoxious condition. Just a tiny splash of water, and all this will be yours. Granted, we do not really know if he meant for the Sultan to read this. If he may have realized that this is a bit of a bad sell. It's not a terribly convincing sales pitch for a Muslim. Granted. But remember, this is an important piece of the public knowledge that people in the West are having about the relationship between Christianity and Islam. The stated intention of this letter is to convert the Sultan. But there's some interesting tacit messages in here. There's recognition of the Sultan's ambition and power. There is recognition of the overlapping histories of the two faiths. And there is an explicit declaration of the Pope's capacity to recognize Ottoman sovereignty. The only thing separating him from doing that is a tiny splash of water. Now, you've got to imagine yourself as a merchant's son, a merchant's daughter, a king, a queen, a noblewoman, a nobleman. You're a property holder. You spend most of your life fighting other people for either for their property or to keep your own, to keep them from taking yours. And here's the Pope who says, you know, the only thing, it could be that the only thing that I need to support an Ottoman Europe is a tiny splash of water. What is that telling you about your world? It's telling you that the future is a very open question. Now, I'd mentioned before that this is part of a corpus of literature that is communicating the idea of a papal sultan exchange. In that letter of Morbisanus, the supposed response, the Sultan claims that the Turks come from Trojans, and they will follow Aeneas, the ancient Trojan refugee who is thought to have founded the city of Rome. They will follow Aeneas to Rome, and they will become the next stage of the Roman Empire. Europeans are telling themselves the Ottomans intend to succeed them as the future legacy of the Roman Empire. The poetic response that the Sultan was supposed to have made attributes to Mehmed these words: "I do not wish to overthrow Christ, but I shall seek the kingdoms of the earlier Trojans, which are part of your dominions." Now this is quite interesting, because part of what what these sources are telling Europeans is, this is not necessarily a war between faiths. It's not necessarily the case that Mehmed means to exterminate Christianity. It may be that he is simply fulfilling another destiny, an imperial destiny. Now, mind you, there are other writings that communicate the other idea, that this is a war of faiths and all of that. But they're not the only things being communicated, and that's the point. Martin Luther, in 1521, got him in trouble, among other things. He mentioned that it would really be better to be subject to the Turks than to be obedient to the Pope. He was called to the carpet for this, among other things, and he backtracked a little bit later, about 9 years later, and he said, it's equally bad to be subject to the Pope or subject to an Ottoman. He just couldn't quite pull himself entirely free from this. When he made that revised opinion, he said, but you know, there are preachers going around who are saying it would be better to be subject to the Pope than to be, better to be subject, to the Sultan than to be obedient to the Pope. I could give you other evidence of the same sort of ambivalence about the future. One of the most interesting expressions of this ambivalence about the future comes from the pen of George of Trebizond, who was that person I mentioned who was sent as an envoy to Mehmed a few years after Pius II died. George of Trebizond, preparing his thoughts to the emperor, said, as part of the appeal he was preparing to make, God is about to reform everything into something better. The diverse changes of events and the unheard of confusion of the communities of Europe in these our times signify that the whole world is about to be reformed into something better. And the throne of Constantine, he says, he prepares to say to Mehmed, the throne of Constantine, that Christian emperor, has been given to you. You have been chosen by the all-powerful God for this majesty. No one could doubt that you are emperor of the Romans by right. And then he goes on to make a similar argument as Pius II did. Since God is doing all this, clearly you are intended to embrace the truer religion, which is Christianity, so you ought to be baptized in order to live up to this great expectation. But notice the order here is changed from Pius II. No one can doubt that you are emperor of the Romans by right. Now, what I'm trying to show you is that a polemical text like this, the Pope arguing for the truth of Christianity with its simple missionizing purpose, if we consider it in its context, proves to be a complex communicative act. It toys with the idea of accommodating a Muslim expansion into Europe. It presupposes the entanglement of Muslim and Christian worlds. What did recent events show them? what did recent events show Mehmed himself? Mehmed's conquest of Constantinople, the Christianized Rome, was, in many minds, no accident. But as George of Trebizond and others plainly said, it was planned by God. And the Sultan himself understood the symbolic value of this achievement. This is the first map to show the monuments built in the city of Constantinople after the Ottoman takeover. It was produced probably in the 1490s. It's drawn into a manuscript copy of an earlier travel book by Cristoforo Buondelmonte, and you're seeing a picture of it here. It includes several of these things that the Sultan built to signify his succession as Emperor of Romans. It included a new palace built here, new mosque and religious complex built here. The Hagia Sophia was the principal church of the Byzantine Empire. This large monument right here. Right after the conquest, it was converted into a mosque. And then the ruins of the Byzantine palace, which included a building that went back to Constantine himself, was left here. So we have this new palace complex, very large, very beautiful, built next to the demonstrative ruin of Constantine's palace. Between the Constantine's palace and the Hagia Sophia, and then the new mosque over here. Soon after the conquest, it was said that the tomb of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, companion of the Prophet who led the conquest or led a siege of Constantinople back in the 7th century, was miraculously discovered just outside the walls. The design of the new mosque, it's been pointed out, included Italianate colonnades. It's a fusion of Eastern and Western influences and interests. All of this very visibly, and mind you, there's a great deal of traffic between Italy in particular and many other places in the West, in the city of Constantinople, Istanbul today. And so this reconstruction of an imperial capital with its resonances toward, its gestures toward ancient Rome and toward Islam. Islam superseding Christianity as Christianity had superseded the Roman Empire. It was very clear. It included this imperial ambition, cultural exchange. The most famous example of this cultural exchange is represented by this painting. The city of Venice established a peace with Mehmed soon after the conquest of Constantinople. Then they found themselves at war, trying to restore some of their lost Aegean possessions. They reestablished a peace in 1479. As soon as they did, Mehmed said, "Send me an artist." They sent him Gentile Bellini, who produced this portrait. And it shows he then lived as an envoy in the city of Constantinople for 2 years. The painter of that first portrait that we saw was sent to Venice from Constantinople in exchange. And again, the purpose of these paintings was probably to use them to foster diplomatic exchanges, to send them to other courts. So this is the image that not only Bellini sort of constructed, a fusion of Eastern and Western elements, as I'll explain in a minute, but also an image that the Sultan wanted to project. It includes a near-profile portrait, which I'm told is a power pose in Venetian art. A classical arch, you see ranging over the top here. These 6 crowns to signify the 6 sultans who preceded Mehmed. And you'll notice they're not turbans, they're Western-style crowns. This very ornate tapestry at the base, and an inscription which names, in Latin, which names the Sultan as the Victor Orbis, the victor of the world. The Sultan, of course, is wearing a fur mantle. He has his red taj and turban, white turban, the scholar's turban, usually represented as oversized for the Sultan, resting on his head. So the rich and the mighty are mixing tastes. It's easy to imagine this sort of mixing happening at every level of society, wherever markets brought travelers, created expat communities, where people brush up against each other, all across the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean in the early modern world. These are tiny instances of a global phenomenon. So again, we're looking at a polarizing religious discourse, crusade, conversion, and we're looking at entanglement, the real conditions of the world, that create exchange. And we're seeing a pope trying to imagine an alternative European future in which the destiny of Christian powers is not absolutely certain. Yes, of course, he wants to fit this into his own framework. Conversion is an element, but he can't actually determine that outcome. I think we have to look at this as a certain accommodation of Muslim presence, even in the absence of an actual Muslim interlocutor. There are tremendous problems with this image of Islam that they're entertaining. It's not a good image, but it's not a black and white image. It's not an image that represents simply oppositions. There is a painting that I think portrays the complex interplay of animosity, complexity, and coexistence that I'm trying to uncover in the story that I'm telling you. And I'd like to end tonight with this picture, this painting. It is painted by a Renaissance painter named Bernardino di Betto, who's known as Pinturicchio, the little painter, because it was short. It was painted between 1502 and 1508 in Siena. This is the city where Pope Pius II was a bishop before he became pope. It's part of a library that was designed as a memorial to the Pope by a nephew of his who had succeeded to what was now an archbishopric of Siena. And in fact, he aspired to the papacy, was elected pope while this was being painted, and then died after a few months. It's the 10th painting in a series of scenes from Pius II's life. It shows us the end of his life. It is looking backwards and forwards to the time when he died and the decades between his death and the painting itself. Okay? It shows us the Pope's arrival at the city of Ancona, where he intended to launch a crusade, the failed crusade that I told you about before. It shows us the Viennese fleet arriving in the background. We have these figures in the foreground, and this is what I'd like to focus our attention on. You see the Pope, elderly, looks somewhat frail, pale, seated on his throne, carried by 4 pallbearers. There's a crowd of people here to his right, on our left. Another crowd here, 2 figures, clearly Ottomans, identified by their turbans, 2 kneeling figures. These 2 are looking in slightly different directions, as you'll see. This one is looking generally at us. This one is giving us a controlling gaze. He's fixing us with his eyes. He's clearly the most powerful person in this picture. The kneeling figures, if we look closely, we can see that this figure here is looking directly at the Pope's foot, whereas this figure, the Ottoman is looking past. The pallbearer is also is calling attention to the feet of the Pope. The Pope's feet are exposed, as they normally are in papal portraits, because the gesture of homage required of Western Christians toward the Pope was called the kisses of blessed feet. We have the first evidence of it from the 11th century. And it was a ritual of homage in which a person kneeled and planted a kiss on the Pope's slipper. So the figure here is clearly, he's moving forward and clearly has his eye fixed, anticipating that gesture. His hat is removed. Here it's held by a page. This has to be performed with a bare head. This figure is not looking at the foot. The head is covered. So we have an act of homage, and not exactly an act of homage, although the figure is leaning. So an unusual juxtaposition of these two characters. Who are these people? This figure here is the Doge of Venice, the leader of Venice, Cristoforo Moro. He's the one who's doing homage. He's the one who's provided the fleet. He's clearly being launched on a crusade. This figure here is Thomas Palaeologus. He is the figure officially recognized by the papacy as the successor to the last Byzantine emperor, the one that Mehmed II had killed. He's looking vaguely in our direction, but not quite at us. So what do we see? Basically, you've got the Pope pointing toward this Ottoman, while gazing in this direction at the people who are supposed to restore the control of Christendom over the Byzantine Empire. This side is much more complicated. And there's controversy in how to identify these figures, and often they're just identified in very vague ways. Oh, they're Ottoman merchants or something like that, it's sometimes said. I think they're actually quite specific. The Pope here is looking at the Crusaders, but pointing toward the future. This individual here is actually, and I'm not the only one who's come up with this identification, one of the sons of Mehmed II. His name is Sultan Cem. When Mehmed died, there was a controversy, as there was almost by necessity, actually by necessity. The succession worked like this among the Ottomans up until the 17th century. The first son to reach Constantinople would be the successor of the Sultan. And so that meant that every transition of power essentially included began with a civil war. And so this happened at Mehmed's death. And what the Sultan would do is try to position the favored son in an office closer to Constantinople so he had basically a better chance. And Cem was the favored son, but his brother, Bayezid, was able to take control of the city, forcing Cem into exile. Normally what would then happen is that all the other brothers and often a number of cousins and grandchildren and so forth who could potentially stand in line to the succession would be killed. So Cem escaped death by fleeing to the island of Rhodes. The Knights of the island of Rhodes took him into custody, and at that point his brother Bayezid started sending the money to the tune of 40,000 ducats a year. It was a pretty good ransom to keep him. They sold him to the King of France. King of France kept him for some years, and one of the successors, Pope Innocent VIII then, in the late 1480s, interested in organizing a crusade, asked the French king to send him Cem. Gem, in the meanwhile, was an item of interest to the King of Hungary, the only power in Europe who was always directly interested in having a crusade because he was right at the frontier with the Ottomans. The Mamluks were interested in him. A lot of people were interested in him. The Pope tried to use Gem in conjunction with a crusade that would possibly install Gem as Sultan. This was left a little bit vague. The whole plan, once again, fell apart. But it is recalled here with Gem not quite giving homage to the Pope, but kneeling to receive a commission. We know that Pope Innocent VIII tried to convert Gem, and we know, even from his Turkish biographers, that he firmly resisted conversion, had no interest whatsoever in converting, getting a sultanate for a baptism. And yet, this plan still went forward. Who then is this character here? It's possible that it could be his brother Bayezid, but it's also possible that the artist is anticipating the future yet a little bit more. The figure, particularly the face, bears some resemblance to portraits of Bayezid's son, Selim I. At the time this was painted, Selim was beginning a conflict, not only with his father Bayezid, but also with his own brothers. It ended up culminating in Selim winning the succession in the year 1512. And here we may see a pope indicating a future that involves Ottoman participation in a campaign interposed in the succession of an Ottoman ruler and points beyond the realm of Christian control, beyond the realm of Christian stereotypes. Again, evidence of an entanglement that conditions the meaning of every juxtaposition that a religious ideology, a religious doctrine has to offer. There's more equivocation in traditional religious teachings than we sometimes realize. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.
You mentioned with some laughter from the audience about Pope Pius II's obnoxious attempt to convert the Sultan. It occurs to me that part of the entanglement that you're mentioning is that both religions are proselytizing religions. Both Islam and Christianity have that desire. So I'm wondering if in this time, if there, besides these fake answers, but if you see with the Ottoman Empire's spread, a similar direction to what Pope Pius was trying to do with his little splash of water.
Right, yeah, sure. Thank you. The Ottoman side had a somewhat more brutal, direct approach to the question of conversion. First of all, the Ottomans did not really have a need to expand empire to convert people. But when they did expand, what they did is they often they demanded Christian children, sometimes as a condition to avoid being conquered, sometimes simply as a conquest of being conquered. So those children were then taken and converted and raised at court. In fact, Mehmed inaugurated a practice that became standard practice among the Ottomans, really for most of the Ottoman Empire, and that is to raise such captive, enslaved children to high positions at court. And so many of his highest courtiers were actually children who grew up that way. What's interesting about this, and then of course the famous Janissaries, his elite military corps, consisted mostly of such captives, enslaved Christians who were then raised into a military elite. The Ottomans weren't the first to do that. The Mamluks were also ruled by a military elite that relied on acquisition of recruits through slavery. So I mean, I'm looking at the Christian side, and you're right, maybe my tone is more cynical than it should be. It's just that when I'm being cynical about, the Pope's ambition to convert, of course, Pope, he's a Pope. He believes in his religion. I mean, what do we expect of a Pope, or a Franciscan, or a Dominican, or even a pious Christian merchant? That's to be expected. By the same token, it's to be expected that a Muslim is going to resist this and will also want to convert a Christian. The terms by which that happens happens on each side are not exactly equal, and it's very important in looking at the relationship of religions to recognize the differences between them. We're just looking at the Christian side right now, so yeah. The thing about this baptism bit that's important to remember is that the approach to baptism it's not just evidence of religious conviction on the Christian side, it's also evidence of the missing interlocutor. There are no Muslims who are really directly shaping the Pope's view of Islam. He's relying on a polemical tradition. It's a little bit different in Islam because there is a tradition of religious dialogue and philosophical dialogue at court. So this goes back to, it's well established by the time of the Abbasids, already in Baghdad in the 9th century. So, there's you bring in the scholars of different faiths together with different philosophical positions and maybe even different legal traditions within Islam, and you hold a masjid and you debate alternative viewpoints and so forth, and it's a kind of intellectual salon. Christianity doesn't really have something like that. In fact, we have some humorous accounts of friars encountering this in their travels in the East and how bizarre they found it. How can you have such a debate and then nobody converts at the end to the truth, mainly, So, the absence of interlocutor is something to keep in mind. It's a limitation on the way in which they recognize the entanglement of civilizations. Yeah, it's still there.
I really appreciate your work, the scholarship that you're doing in terms of having us kind of reimagine the idea about a clash of civilizations and your term, the entanglement of civilizations. However, I think, and I agree with you, you mentioned this idea, I think it's important for us not to romanticize this particular moment in history with Pope Pius II, because as you know better than I know, a few years later after Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, Islam became the singular kind of trope of demonization, both by Catholics and Protestants. As a matter of fact, Martin Luther talked about the idea of the Antichrist manifested itself in the Catholic Church and Islam / the Ottomans. So
Right.
I agree with you, and I think that if one is to map the whole relationship, the genealogy of the entanglement, we see that the formulation of those ideas about the demonization of Islam often are dominant in terms of the narrative. And I think it's important for us to do that. The final thing is, I think we should connect that narrative also with religion in service to power and in service to empire, which is something that manifests also in Pope Pius II's era.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you on both points. In the course, it takes Luther some time to develop that position, and still to describe it the way he did was more generous toward the Ottomans than many other Protestants would have liked. The position you just described. Part of that has to do with the power of Suleiman and the politics of the Reformation itself. The relationship of Protestant powers to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was the principal figure in Europe, the political power, trying to withstand further expansion of the Ottomans. He was basically Suleiman's main competitor in the Mediterranean. At the same time, the French king, who was also of interest to some of the Protestant powers, had actually formed a treaty of friendship forged with the Ottoman power. This is the most Catholic king of France, quote unquote, that's his title, with Suleiman, explored already in 1533, and then clearly in place in the 1540s. And that became the basis of a long-term collaboration between the French and the Ottomans, diplomatic exchanges, even sometimes military collaboration. Now, again, the King of France pursuing those alliances, because he's an enemy of the Habsburgs, a competitor of the Habsburgs, pursuing those alliances, he still declares himself to be an enemy of Islam. So the point that I'm trying to make is, well, let's not take that declaration at face value as a simple description of reality. Let's interpret it in the light of these other complexities, and then see what it means religiously. So even here, even though the traditional polemic is, personally, for my taste, it's far more oppositional and antithetical toward the other than I would want to tolerate for myself or promote. But even that has some ambivalences in it, and that was the point that I was trying to make. But thank you for raising that. Those are very important points. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris.